The voyage to America became known as the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans, including the Swanson slaves' ancestors, were shipped to America. 10.7 million survived the voyage. 1.8 million perished along the way. An African family of four could have a family member auction off in Hispaniola, one auction off in Brazil, one auction off in Jamaica, and the last one auctioned off in Virginia. Each family member never to see one another again. From 1735 to 1750, the state of Georgia prohibited African slavery. After South Carolina plantation owners began gaining wealth from slavery, Georgia overturned their ban and decided to use slaves to grow rice and cotton. Georgia plantation owners requested Africans from the great city of Benin region of Africa, which is present-day Sierra Leone, Gambia, and Angola, for their knowledge of building earthworks, dams, and banks and irrigation systems to support rice and cotton crops. To foster growth, in 1780, Georgia began offering land if people moved to the state. The land economy was developed when the European country established a colony. So it wasn't until the Revolutionary War when they actually created that, what they call was land bounty, where if you were a soldier in the army or an officer, you were awarded a certain amount of land. Like some generals got 25,000 acres of land, like Robert E. Lee, Washington, Paul Revere, Jefferson, all those guys. The government gave them land. With those large lands they had, and they could grow products and they could ship them and make money. So now they got the land, but blacks and the slaves were never allowed to participate in the land bounty. The slaves never had an opportunity to acquire land or acquire wealth, and they could only just work on those plantations that were owned by the whites. And that's what really started America, because without owning something, you had no wealth. But because the whites could participate in the land bounty, they had immense opportunity. Years before blacks were able to own land. In early 1787, William Swanson, having sold some of his plantations in Virginia, moved to Greene County, Georgia, and started buying plantations. He bought a 575-acre plantation on the Oconee River in Greene County, Georgia, on January 5th, 1787. Of course, they wouldn't let me do any filming inside the courthouse at the Land and Deed office, but they did let me do some photocopies of some of the deeds. After selling his land and slaves in Virginia, he bought the land, bought more slaves, and helped to develop out the state of Georgia. Using his land and his slaves, that development of Georgia exists right today. So his descendants and a lot of other slave owners' descendants in the state of Georgia, by utilizing their slaves, helped to develop the state, and they enjoyed that environment, but the slaves was relegated to substandard living and substandard means. On August 2nd, 1787, he bought 300 plus acre plantation on the North Fork of Little River in Wilkes County, Georgia. So next to Wilkes County Courthouse, and again they wouldn't let me take any film in there, but I was able to look through the land and the deed records, and William Swanson purchased land in this county after purchasing acreage in Greens County. He moved here, he purchased a bunch of land here, had a bunch of slaves, and he did farming, probably growing tobacco. And of course with the slaves, they developed out this area, and so of course the slaves wasn't allowed to participate and enjoy in the infrastructure and the environments that they built for the slave owners and other whites in the area. And even up until this day it's the same. Descendants of slaves, black, African Americans, are not allowed to participate in American society. The majority of blacks are still on the margins of society, and where they remain on those margins. I'm on my way to a town called Lexington, Georgia. It's in Oglethorpe County. I'm going to Lexington because in Lexington is the county courthouse, and it's going to have all the birth records and all the property deeds that Slave Master Swanson owned. I'll be able to find out what he did with the property, who he gave the property to, and how much property it was, and the people that he bequeathed the property to when he passed away. I'll be able to find out exactly who they were and where their family background goes. Like if they married, like if Swanson married Coleman, then I got to trace that Coleman line to find out what they did with the property. So when we get to Lexington, to the courthouse, then I'll go inside and I'll look at the records. William Sr. died around November 7th, 1808 in Oglethorpe County, Georgia. This is his last will and testament. The will states, "I give and recommend my soul to Almighty God to be buried in a Christian manner, hoping at the resurrection I shall receive the same again in family, slaves, wealth, by the mighty power of God, and touching such worldly estate which it has pleased God to bless me with in this life." I required that the names of my slaves to be set on a piece of paper, put into a box, and be drawn and divided to my children in eighths. In the will, William gives to Nathan $850, a slave wench named Sylvia, and a Negro boy named Adam that he had rented out to him, 1/8 of all of his other slaves, and 1/8 of all of his money that was left. To Sarah Ryan, he gave 1/8 of his slaves and 1/8 of his money. To Mary Wilson, he gave $350, a slave wench named Nanny, plus 1/8 of his slaves and 1/8 of his money. To William Jr., he gave $321, 1/8 of his slaves and 1/8 of his money. Ann Swanson, he gave $275, a slave boy, 1/8 his slaves, 1/8 his money. And Fanny, he gives $235, slave wench named Nancy, 1/8 of his slaves, and 1/8 of his money. His grandsons, James and John, heirs of his son John Swanson, he gave 1/8 slaves and 1/8 his money. To his granddaughters, Anne, Betsy, Sally, and Polly, $350 each, 1/8 slaves, 1/8 money, and a slave wench named Rachel. After the death of William, he was taken back to Swansonville, Virginia, and buried in a cemetery in the rear of the Swansonville Methodist Church. William Jr. had remained at the plantation in Swansonville, Virginia, when his father, William, had moved to Georgia. He continued to run the tobacco plantation with his son, William Graves Swanson. The two went on and created the Swansonville Supply Company, the Swanson Brothers Company, the Park Place Mercantile Company, and became part owners in the Turner Brothers Tobacco Company and Manufacturing, and the Dudley and Clement Lumber Company, located in Greensboro, North Carolina. From the plantations his father ran in Georgia, during off-season when not harvesting cotton, William Jr. sent his slaves to the recently discovered gold mines to mine gold for him. In 1828, a slave owned by a man named Logan found gold on a branch in the Nacoochee River. The slaves knew how to find gold as their technique had been passed down to them for centuries. White independent miners hated the slave miners because they were best at finding gold and often referred to them as proverbially lucky. Slave owners rushed to the region and sent their slaves to mine for gold. Some slaves were promised freedom if they found enough gold, but they were never freed no matter the amount they found. Slave owners became wealthy from the gold fields. Then the slaves were not permitted to stake claims in the gold fields. The gold fields was in the Cherokee Nation, but when Logan's slave discovered the gold, the U.S. government rounded up the Indians and put them on the Trail of Tears march to Oklahoma and took over their lands. From 1808 to 1914, John Swanson and John Mew Swanson, son and grandson of William Graves Swanson, increased the family's business holdings as they invested their profits from enslaving human beings. The family's business portfolio went from a meager ice company to a commercial bank. The list of family-owned businesses now included Turner Brothers Tobacco Company, Swansonville Supply Company, Swanson Brothers Company, Park Place Mercantile Company, Dudley and Clement Lumber Company, Ogilvy and Swanson Brothers, South Atlantic Lumber Company, the Arctic Ice Company, the Commercial Bank of Danville. These are the legends of the Swanson Brothers businesses, found at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. William became a legislator in the Virginia State Legislature and began to push for a railroad line to connect Danville to Richmond as a faster way to move tobacco and lumber throughout the region. With his allies, the state of Virginia granted him a charter to build a railroad line. William and his allies used their slaves and built 140 miles of railroad track to connect Danville to Richmond by rail. Up until the Civil War around 1850, all the railroads in the United States were being built by African American slaves. Over 15,000 slaves built over 8,700 miles of railroad track. If we laid this railroad track out in a straight line, it would cross the United States 3 times.
Lay down my problem, gonna lay down my pain. This here soon be over, gonna be with that dream. It'll be over now. It'll be over now. It'll be over now. It'll be over now. Lay down my problem, gonna lay down my pain. This here soon be over, gonna be with that dream.
Investors spent over $370 million by 1850 invested in the railroads. 10 years later, by 1860, they had invested over $1 billion. None of this was shared with the slaves, and none of it has been shared with the descendants of the slaves, even though the ancestors of the slaves built these railroads. Chartered on March 9th, 1847, the railroad completed its 140-mile line between Richmond and Danville in 1856. During the American Civil War, the railroad was a vital link between Richmond, the Confederate capital, and the rest of the Confederacy. Many slaves died building the railroads as it was dangerous work. and used men, women, and children. Slave owners insured them and was compensated for their deaths. Though the slaves built the railroads, they were not allowed to ride on the trains they were built for. Now we can add the Danville-Richmond Railroad line to the list of businesses owned by the Swanson brothers. 73% of white people in America today believe the descendants of slaves, the majority of whom live in poverty, should not be compensated or reparated for their contributions in building the infrastructure of the American economic superpower. They normally respond with, "I didn't own any slaves," or "I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did." Claude Augustus Swanson was born March 31st, 1862, on the Swanson plantation in Swansonville. He was the last Swanson slave master and was 3 years old when the Civil War ended, freeing the slaves. Though he was only 3 years old when the slaves were freed, let's see how he enjoyed and prospered like the 73% of white people today who say they didn't own any slaves from the infrastructure built by the slaves. At the end of the Civil War, the government paid $350 to each slave owner for each slave that they freed for reparations. In today's money, that's $8,000 per slave. Claude attended school at the Whitmill Farm Life School. It was a 2-room schoolhouse built by slaves on the plantation. It was the first school in Pennsylvania County, Virginia, organized by the wealthy slave owners and taught by Celestial Parrish, a Swansonville native. It eventually became the Whitmill School, named after a famed state legislator, and remained on the state's historical society list. After completing the Whitmill Farm Life School, Claude attended the Randolph-Macon College. It was built by slaves in 1830 and was attended by males only. Currently, both men and women attend. The campus housed 3 buildings, Washington and Franklin Hall and the Methodist Church. Today it boasts 116 acres and 60 major buildings. Claude graduated in June 1885, having majored in Latin, German, and chemistry, and decided to study law at the University of Charlottesville, Virginia. The story of the American college is largely the story of the rise of the slave economy, spoken by Craig Wilder, historian, MIT. Slaves built the University of Virginia starting in 1817 until 1865, the end of the Civil War. They were rented from local slave owners who was paid their wages. Once the university was built, the slaves worked maintaining classrooms, laboratories, the library, ringing the bell, and catering to the daily needs of students and faculty. The irony is, ancestors of the slaves once taught white people in the universities of Africa. Now they were not even allowed to read, and attending the universities they built was out of the question. After law school, he returned to Swansonville, practiced law, and engaged in regional politics. Claude became the 45th governor of Virginia in 1906. Slaves built the mansion in 1813. All the governors who spent a term in the mansion is remembered. Even the furniture is often recorded, but there's not a name or picture of a slave that built it or who served the governors and his family while living there. During his term, he defunded the few schools for blacks the state had and set up a eugenics program that would flourish. The Virginia New Program sought to protect the purity of the white race with forced sterilization of those deemed unworthy or unfit to procreate. Many African American women were sterilized unknowingly as they were told some other explanation for their operations. Clark became the 45th Senator of Virginia from 1910 until 1933. He moved his home to Eldon, a plantation in Chatham, Virginia, where he lived when not in Washington, D.C. He supported child labor law and banking law reforms, reduced tariffs and federal funding of highway construction, but opposed women's suffrage. Clark became Secretary of the Navy in Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration from 1933 to his death in 1939. While Navy Secretary, he oversaw passage and implementation of the largest peacetime naval appropriations up to that time. Upon his death, his funeral rites were held in the Senate Chamber in Washington, D.C. He was buried in the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, holding his final resting place with two U.S. presidents, James Madison and John Tyler, as well as Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, and 25 Confederate generals, including George Pickett and Jeb Stuart. For Clark's service to the nation and the Navy, the USS Swanson, a destroyer-class ship of the U.S. Navy, was named for him. After its launch, it began escort and convoy duties between New England, Bermuda, and Iceland. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, its convoy duties were extended to Scotland, Nova Scotia, and Greenland. The destroyer was decommissioned December 10, 1945, and scrapped in 1972. He died, leaving a last will and testament to his second wife, Lulie Lyons, the sister of his first wife, Elizabeth Dean Lyons. Neither wife bore him a child. Clark's will to his wife included ownerships in Dan River Cotton Mills, South Atlantic Lumber Company, Dominion Securities Corporation, Intercontinental Development Company, Standard Brands, Espada Mines Company, Virginia and Mexico Mine and Smeltering Corporation, Washington Gold Mining Company, Riverside Land Company, Sullivan Group Mining Company, Wonderful Group Mining Company, Miller Creek Mining Company, 6 Mile Canyon Mining Company, and Old Dominion Gold Mines Company. Total inheritance left to his wife was $181,170. And in today's dollars, it totaled $3,600,000. $623,400. This did not include real estate he owned. Swen Gunnison had 5 children, 32 grandchildren, and 120 great-grandchildren. Among his many descendants today are all the members of the DuPont family of Delaware, who trace their lineage to Christopher Swanson, William's brother.